So here up to now we discussed about these selectors. So in this session I just explained. So every software and every language has some boundaries like this software or this language can perform some operations. So CSS has some limitations. So we learn these limitations here. Limitation of CSS. Limitations of CSS. So what is the limitations of CSS can follows. So CSS cannot perform any logical operations like subtraction, like multiplications, like addition, subtraction, multi, and we have this division like this. So CSS cannot perform. So CSS cannot perform any logical operations. And so first point is CSS cannot perform any logical operation. That means it is not do any addition and subtraction using the CSS. Next we can't read any file using the CSS. So without HTML we can't do anything with the CSS. So with HTML only it is possible to create stunning web pages, and is it possible to read the files. So CSS cannot read the cannot read any files. And so we cannot interact with the databases. The third point is, so using the CSS we can't interact with the database. So CSS cannot interact with the database. So using the CSS we can't connect the database. So it is not impossible to connect the database using the CSS. So CSS has some limitations. So first point is CSS cannot perform any logical operations like subtraction and multiplications and division. And using the CSS, we can't read the files. Without HTML, we cannot read the files in CSS. And read means we can't run the CSS file in the inside of the browser without HTML. And CSS cannot interact with the databases. So using the CSS, we can't connect the database here. And CSS cannot require any web pages. Why? Because using the HTML only we can request any web pages. So CSS cannot require any web pages. That is the fourth point. We have the CSS cannot require any web pages. So these are the limitations can followed by the CSS. CSS cannot perform any logical operations. CSS cannot read any files. CSS cannot interact with the database. CSS cannot require web pages.